Thank you, Catherine. So Maximo gave you an overview of the trends in terms of hunger and conflict. Alex, I think, brought that alive by talking about trends in conflict over the last century and a half. And today I'm really going to talk a little bit about a country case study specifically. So each year, once we have chosen the theme Welthungerhilfe, Welthungerhilfe and concern, we always produce case studies, which is very much around the view on the ground. What does this particular topic look like on the ground for people affected? And so I'm just going to talk a little bit about the case study of South Sudan. Interestingly enough, it's one of those countries that's in grey in the report, so we don't have the data, but I think we all know it's probably somewhere at the alarming end of the scale. Just a short potted history on the conflict in South Sudan, for those of you who don't know it. I mean, since the 1950s, roughly over 2.5 million lives have been lost and livelihoods of tens of millions have been affected. Core part of that conflict has been between the Khartoum government and what was then the Sudanese People's Liberation Army or movement in the south between 1983 and 2005. So you had a north-south war, which is really about control of resources, but also the south wanted its political autonomy and a certain level of secularism. Eventually that conflict got resolved through the Comprehensive Peace Agreement in 2005. The South Sudanese people had a referendum and voted for independence, and they became the newest state in the world in July 2011. Unfortunately, that government didn't last too long, in the sense that there was a split in the SPLA government in December 2013. And essentially a split between the president and then the vice president at the time, which unfortunately was a little bit around ethnic lines between the Dinka and the Nuer. But there's huge displacement between 150,000 and 200,000 people to UN protection camps and a number of people to neighbouring countries as well. So this is a map of South Sudan, and it's kind of more conflict events, more in food insecurity, question mark. This is a graph of the ACLED armed conflict events that ACLED is now mapping on I think a weekly basis, and it shows where the worst food security situation is, and there's a rough correlation between them. You can see the place where there's most conflict have the worst levels of food insecurity. So today I want to talk really about two different effects of conflict on food security. The first is much more indirect in northern Bahr Ghazal in the northwest, and the second one is much more direct around people who have actually fled to the protection of UN camps and have been absolutely directly affected by conflict. So the case study I'm really going to talk about is really about people who fled to the Bentiu camp in Unity State. What's interesting, I suppose, is when I talked with people, and I talked with 150 people over the course of a week, they all had a historical perspective. They were used to conflict events in Sudan over the last 20, 30 years. They all remembered bad years, and they all remembered, flooding. It was usually climatic. It was either flooding or drought, where they had to look at their coping strategies to get around hunger. So this is Mary, what she's saying about the situation in 1988. This lady explained exactly why they came to the camp. We came to the camp because of the conflict. Our village was burned, our houses burned down, 10 of our close relatives were killed. 5 men, 2 women, 3 children. 2 women and children were killed intentionally. And what was different for them, they felt, was that there was an intentional targeting of women, children, civilians in this particular conflict, and it was quite different for them. They were terrified. They fled to the camp for protection. What's interesting, of course, is they came from long distances, many of them taking up to 3 weeks to reach the camp, walking from long distances to get there. They came from places in the south, like Lear in the south of Unity State, but from all over Unity State and from beyond. So there were days and days of hunger. On those precarious journey, what they ate were water lilies from the rivers and wild foods from the forest. And they're strong statements saying what we ate was the gum, the part of the tree exposed when you cut a branch diagonally. So the people were desperate to eat on the way. We only depended on that. So they also know, I suppose, the kinds of foods, the wild foods that they can eat and what they can't eat. But that's what happened. They didn't have food stored up. They had to flee at very short notice and sought the protection of the camps. This is the UN camp in Bentiu, guarded by the UN. People fled there. Very quickly organic developing camp, which was actually very badly flooded in the middle of 2014. And Concern actually developed a whole new form of shelter And we rebuilt, or basically the camp got rebuilt over a 6-month period, so that in the middle of 2015 it wasn't affected by bad flooding and was a much safer place to live. Camp of what became 100,000 people very quickly. When people get to the camp, of course, they need to be fed. A classic humanitarian situation. Alex referred to what was required. Welthungerhilfe, our partners here from Germany, were the ones who are actually doing the food distributions in the camp. So standard food distributions keep people alive, get them food. Concern classically focuses on nutrition, management of acute malnutrition, and infant and young child feeding programs. And that's what we were doing in the camp, as well as provision of water. But again, you know, when you're a camp resident, and we've seen this from protracted crises all over the years, people are in these camps sometimes, if you go back to the Cambodian refugees in Thailand, in the camps for 17, 18 years. You know, people are saying the worst thing about living in a camp is we're like prisoners here. We have no access in and out, really. So people feel that when they move to a camp situations in very short notice. It's not quite true, however. And what's really interesting, I got up at 6:30 in the morning, and you could see people leaving the camp actually to go out. And it's kind of interesting, this berm here, the camp is constructed with these large berms for protection, but actually you can walk over them relatively easily. People walked out partly because they wanted to forage to get firewood and to be able to sell it so they could buy some other things, a bit for food. We heard stories though of people also taking the rations out and bringing them out to men. So, you know, it's quite an interesting and dynamic environment, much more than you would expect. I was amazed by the vibrancy of the market. I mean, if you think about 100,000 people in a camp, it's actually a big town. And there's a real market in there, and it's a really vibrant market. You don't often associate that with refugee camps, but that's actually what it is. So, you know, sometimes the food that's been given out is being sold in the market. People do all these things. Again, this is actually from Majuba camp, where we're using vouchers so that people will actually, you know, they can use the vouchers to get prioritized foodstuffs to keep them properly nourished. But actually people were selling the vouchers for under their value so they could get cash, because people love the flexibility that cash brings, and they can do various different things with it. But the major conclusion really around the link between conflict and food security here is that it's all about lack of secure peace. If there was a peace in the morning, those people would be out of that camp as quickly as they could. Although the women said they would not move from the camp until their men came to give them permission, which is very interesting. But what was interesting also is they said they could regain their original livelihoods in a matter of 6 months. And I was really surprised by that. That would be that quick. And I think it would obviously depend on the timing in terms of harvest and planting season, etc. But people were shocked by the nature of the conflict. They felt that it changed the goalposts. And my worry would be about potential for lasting and deep divisions. But this goes on to the second part of the case study, which is a much more indirect impact of conflict on hunger. And this is said is in northern Bahr Ghazal in the northwest, where Concern has actually been working for 20 years. We've been working a lot on humanitarian interventions for about 10, and over about the last 10 years we've been doing much more developmental work on food security, agricultural programs, and health and nutrition programs. This is Dinka country, classic Dinka country, and the cattle, the importance of cattle to the Dinka culture is really profound. You know, it's really a incredibly strong part of their livelihoods and part of their culture. So I like that proverb, money falls through your fingers, but cattle are forever. And we had lots of quotes of people of the importance of the cattle to their livelihoods. Vibrant goat fair in a local market, you know, so animals are really important from a nutritional point of view, but also as part of people's livelihoods. Again, what was really interesting talking with people is that I had a very strong memory of the older people, certainly of the bad years over the last 20 years or so. And they said the 3 bad years really were 1988, 1993, and 1998. And again, you know, at this stage, there were attacks coming from northern Sudan by the Masria Arabs. And they used to come down, do a bit of looting, and return again. And again, you know, houses were burnt down, people lived under trees, people fled. And this chief said that, you know, out of 1,500 people in the village, after the attacks, only 89 remained. So a lot of people fled, which is one of the coping strategies. I'll talk about that in a second. This man attacked quite an older man. He was saying that 1988 was the worst. You know, again, the Masria came down, they burned crops and granaries, but there was also a massive flood. And so people starved. They died on the roads to northern Sudan as they went to trying to seek work elsewhere. But they also had to feed the SPLA, or the local army, which was another draw on food. And in fact, they said in those days people used to bury food beneath their houses or in the bush to keep it out of them so they have enough for themselves. What I thought was really interesting actually was when people talked about their coping strategies, and I just assembled them like this, basically like a ladder of them, where this is the first thing we'll do, this is the second, this is the third. It may not always be in exactly this order, but if you look at it here, there are 14 different coping strategies that people move to. The final one being just abandoning the land and moving away altogether, which is what we heard from one of the people there. But you can see all of the types of things that people do, but they're actually very systematic and very analytical about what they need to do in order to survive and to have enough to eat. And that actually doesn't even include probably some of the taboo coping strategies that we didn't even talk about, crime, sexual favors, and all of those things which weren't even brought up. But people are analytical about them. Again, the wild foods, it was really interesting. I mean, people really know their wild foods. They know exactly the foods they're going to eat when they're in trouble. They know what they are, and these are a number of them. Again, the effects of the current fog. So you didn't have direct fighting in this area, but you had fighting in other parts of the country which had an impact on them. So you've got less goods in the market, so you've got restrictions on movements, trade into the country and across the country. That's leading, of course, to price increases, and you can see there, threefold price, three and fourfold price increases for sorghum and groundnuts. So that makes it very difficult for poor communities to survive. Spiraling inflation. Traders stop lending food to people because they know they won't get paid back. Very hard to get remittances. So when people do migrate as a coping strategy and they send remittances back to their family, it's actually physically difficult to get that money back now because of trade restrictions. And in fact, one of the men I showed there had actually been robbed on the way back from northern Sudan. And again, loss of the male labour to cultivate the land because they're going to fight in the war. So they're more indirect effects, but they're actually still effects, and important effects on people's food security. I thought this quotation from the Paramount Chief Santino was really interesting. Currently we're fighting an internal war among ourselves, a war with Republic of Sudan, and a war against hunger. And he phrased it like that, a war against hunger. So just to wrap up, I mean, poor members of this community in Nyamiel, they use a very analytical balancing of risk and opportunities related to the household food economy. They really go from the highs of food sufficiency and asset accumulation in the good years, where they've had a number of good years, they've got good harvests, and they've been able to accumulate assets, to the negative coping strategies and severe hunger in bad years. The lowest point in the really bad years are the ones where there's some kind of a coexistence between climate variability, drought or flooding, and the impact of armed conflict, so attacks. To me, there's hope in the story, though, of recurring disasters and frequent knockbacks. The hope is in the ability of the community to bounce back and rebuild an asset base that's their protection against future disasters. And I was actually surprised that when people talked about 1988 and 1993 and 1998, they were kind of back on their feet within 2-3 years. I kind of expected it might be longer, but you'll argue about whether that's a long time or not. And my final conclusion, really, I suppose, I like Justino's suggesting that the indirect effects of conflict on households are channeled through markets, political institutions, and social networks. My feeling that in South Sudan, certainly in the middle of last year, the markets and the social networks continue to operate quite dynamically, even though there's restrictions on markets. But the political institutions seem very distant and ineffective. Again, I think that's very reflective of a lot of the commentaries now on the weak functioning of state institutions in many African countries. So, Andrews, Pritchett, Michael Woolcock at Harvard and the World Bank are talking about this, poor state functioning. And I think this is a real issue for us in working in fragile states. But the conclusions of Alan Ovey suggesting that dysfunctional institutions lie at the heart of structural food insecurity seem very apt in the current context of South Sudan.